All right, gentlemen, good afternoon. Excuse the delay, world. This balance of Black men's health, which is a part of it, always trying to figure out the priorities. As I was telling the gentleman, I got a chance to get about 7 miles in with my wife running and walking, always wonderful chasing behind her. But unfortunately, that had a technical delay, so excuse the delay. Wonderful to have Ace Callwood back. Welcome back, sir. Welcoming Dr. Reginald Ellis.
Thank you for having me.
University. I'm looking forward to this discussion. So we are talking about Confederate statues and monuments. Ace, the last time that we had a discussion, and thank you for coming back, we promised we would have a second part. Who knew it would be so fast? We were specifically talking about this beautiful imagery that I got a chance to see of the Stonewall Jackson statue, I believe, that's in Richmond, Virginia. And there was a wonderful digital, cast shown of Harriet Tubman on the monument with Black Lives Matter, and again, beautiful imagery of Harriet Tubman, and someone was making a note on Twitter that they were conflicted about the statue coming down because of how beautiful that imagery was being projected. Who knew? You and I talked on a Tuesday, and I think Wednesday, the world started to see that statue actually being removed. There were cranes in the air, and Ace, I'll be quiet and let you take it from there. Then we can get on into it.
Oh yeah, so I'll lend the context I have, fully acknowledging that we have an esteemed professional on the call as well, who knows the history perhaps better than I do. So, I'm based in Richmond, Virginia, as my dad gives me a hard time, the former capital of the Confederacy. So I, living between the healthcare world, the innovation world, and the diversity world, walking around Richmond, as a relic of past eras, perhaps. Richmond has the largest collection of second place participation trophies in the country. So, we have quite a few monuments. I literally, working down at the health system, was in the middle of a project that was in Jefferson Davis's backyard. So we built a decontamination protocol for N95 masks through COVID-19, literally in the former Museum of the Confederacy, which is in the backyard of the White House of the Confederacy. And so in the midst of that project, I was sitting on the front steps of the White House of the Confederacy, sending emails. And I think that was probably the first time one of us was allowed on those front steps.
Wow.
And, and so we have that imagery. And then, of course, we have the historic Monument Avenue down the middle of Richmond, Virginia, which starts up at the corner of the newly renamed Arthur Ashe Boulevard. Arthur Ashe is a Richmonder, running all the way down to Lombardy, and then down into Monroe Park. And we've got a series of statues now, starting with Arthur Ashe. We've got maybe one past that, and I'm blanking on the name, but Stonewall Jackson is right at the intersection of Monument Avenue and Arthur Ashe Boulevard, or should I say was. This past week, Stonewall Jackson came down as the first of the institution, if you will, taking down monuments. The public has been taking down monuments over the last couple weeks. So Columbus was thrown into Bird Park. Wickham statue in Monroe Park was taken down, and I literally climbed up on the pedestal and had a picture of me in place of that statue. And a couple others have been removed around the city by the public, but the city itself just took down Stonewall. Jeb Stuart just came down this week as well. And then there's a Daughters of the Confederacy, or the Confederate Sailors, I believe, statue was just removed yesterday as well, yesterday morning. So 3 official statues have been pulled. General Lee, that statue you were speaking to, John, with Harriet Tubman projected onto it, is really kind of the nexus of the contention here in Richmond, and that is still up.
Oh, so that was another one. Okay, that was another
I
one.
believe
Okay, that was
is
another
owned by the state, and there's some legal around that, so an injunction was filed. But yeah, there's a lot of work happening here in Richmond, and a lot of it centers specifically around removing those statues as a starting point, but not ultimately the overarching work that we need to do for racial equity, justice, and of course, police brutality and the conversation we're having across America. But a really cool place to see that starting and see it happening actively in my community.
Indeed. Well, Dr. Ellis, again, as Ace referenced, you being the esteemed title on the panel here, give us your feedback. I mean, obviously, Ace and I got a chance to really dig into it about his Medium article recently written about being seen, and just about, all the social justice issues, all the, systemic and structural racism, and all the, just all the change in the world that's going on all at once, and how many people are reaching out to us. And obviously, Black men's health is so much more than physical health. It's really holistic health. So we really speak about holistic health as, physical health and spiritual health, financial health, mental health, social health, just, holistic. So, we kind of put this in the bucket of social health, about all the things that are going on. I hadn't got a chance to talk to you. Tell us about what you got going on in the world and how you see this going on in the world. And then we can get into these Confederate monuments and statues and what's going on with that. I would love to hear your feedback as a historian.
Oh, well, first of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I will say that I am currently a member of the American Historical Association Council, which is their board of directors. Over 12,000 members, part of that historical organization. And we've had several conversations over the past, I would say, 2 or 3 months. First conversation that we had obviously was in response to the lynching of George Floyd. And one of the things that you just said resonated and hit me was being seen, right? As a group of people, as African Americans, being seen. When you start to think about the Confederate War monuments and those relics of the past, one of the things that it must not be overlooked is that Black people, in the process of those monuments being erected, were not being seen. Those monuments were erected as relics of a past that did not represent this nation as a whole. It only represented the Confederate States of America, not the United States of America. And so I think that when we look at what's happening now in America, you have a group of people who are saying, we want to be represented. We weren't at the table when you all put these monuments up using tax dollars. We weren't at the table when you decided to put them in our site. And so obviously, everything has a history. Obviously, we don't need to forget history, but we also don't need to forget why those monuments, the specific monuments were chosen and the specific location for those monuments were chosen. And so I think that a conversation like this should have happened in the late 19th century when these monuments were first built, and definitely in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s when you started to see streets being renamed, the Confederate flag starts to fly over southern state capitals. And when you think about the Confederate States of America, and I'm gonna be quiet, when you start to think about the Confederate States of America, teach us. You start to see how it leaves the South and moves to the North and moves to the West, and you have individuals flying the Confederate flag in places that did not represent the ideals of the Confederacy. And so you start to understand how deeply embedded white supremacy was in the idea of the Confederate States of America. And I'll close this thought by saying, and I talked about this a few weeks ago on another panel discussion, I watched the Netflix video of Dave Chappelle's most recent show, and he said something that was very profound from I would almost say a philosophical perspective, that the streets are speaking, right? If the government didn't allow the people's voice to be heard, to say, hey, these relics are not representative of the United States of America. The streets are saying, since you all won't take action, we will take action, because this is indeed our land. This is indeed the United States of America. And so we have a right to control our outcome. And so I thought it was very brilliant at how he framed it. And it kind of sets the table for what's going on right now, because the government won't act, the people are. And that's the true history of America.
It is.
Indeed.
And,
Indeed. Yeah.
Can I
everybody's reference,
touch on something really quickly, John?
Please.
Dr. Ellis, the statement you made about the statues or those Confederate war monuments being strategically placed, I especially here in Richmond, we see that we see the contrast and the intentionality of the placement, specifically down Monument Ave. That was a line of delineation for an all-whites neighborhood. The charter of that neighborhood, of that street and kind of the surrounding areas, was such that the blacks were not allowed to own in that neighborhood. And so to have these overbearing, imposing, statues that say something, because symbolism does matter. If symbolism
Absolutely.
didn't matter, we wouldn't see folks painting over Black Lives Matter murals on the street, right? They do mean something. What that is implicitly saying and has been explicitly stated is, my symbols matter, yours don't. Mm-hmm. And so for us to have the contrast of Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War, not couple blocks down from where Stonewall Jackson just came down, it's sitting in front of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, right next door to the Daughters of Confederacy building. That contrast, to see an urban Black man, somebody who looks like us with locks in urban streetwear in this equestrian pose, that is equally imposing, but that symbolism that means something and starts to lend some representation to our community, that's important. And the contrast, I think, has been really interesting to me through all of this.
I wanted to make sure that everybody understood Dr. Ellis's reference when he was speaking about Dave Chappelle. That piece is a Netflix special, 846, and which references obviously the time that the officer, not bad apple, a bad officer, was on George Floyd's neck. And one of the things I speak about when you talk about somebody like Chappelle, Eddie Murphy, I just watched some not Raw, I saw Delirious the other night, which my wife told me to stop mouthing every word, because I can say that from the beginning. I had a tape back in the day before I ever saw that, is that, comedians that do what they do well are geniuses, right? The timing, everything. So what Chappelle was squeezing into that brief time that he was on stage in a new socially distanced environment was brilliant, I thought. And how much he packed into that is also maddening, right? The fact that he was just, name after name after name, which is something that even in a most recent discussion I had, we were speaking about mental health and, just all of the influx of media and content and things of that nature, even, seeing these names over and over and over again, and sometimes not even being able to keep up. Is this a new situation? Is this an old situation? It's just so much. So, Man. So, Dr. Ellis, you spoke about a time frame, and I have heard this a lot. Please do share, this movement of Confederate statues and monuments. And usually a lot of people speak about, a time frame that this happened in and what and why and things of that nature. Would you educate us, sir?
Yeah, so a great book from a historical perspective to pick up is by historian David Blight, entitled Race and Reunion. And I actually had the book here, and just so, for your audience. Now, what we know is that after Reconstruction came to an end, you had the individual sons and daughters of the Confederacy that was created to really help recreate what happened during the Civil War. When you start thinking about the idea of race and reunion and what these Confederate monuments were about, that's when we get this idea of that this war was a war amongst brothers, that this war was just a disagreement. There's a passage in this book very early on that talks about how historians in that era were writing about, when I say that era in the early 20th century, were writing about the memory of the Civil War. So let's pause right there and just think about when what these Civil War monuments and the Confederate flag is about is a memory. And so, and they wanting other individuals to remember something different than what happened. And so the reason you start to see individuals in the North embrace the Confederacy is because we remember it different than what the Confederacy was representing. Remember, the United States of America was legally had the institution of slavery. The United States of America legally ordained, if you will, by law, the institution of slavery until the 13th Amendment passed. So the Confederacy was created in defense of slavery when the United States of America said it is time to end slavery. So the Confederate States of America, these monuments come about, not the monuments don't come about during the Civil War. They don't come about during Reconstruction. They come about after Reconstruction ends to now rewrite what this war was about. So when we start to look at the war and you start to understand, and I don't know how history was taught in your particular schools, what we start to see and how we start to read the history of that particular war, it's almost eerily similar to what Donald Trump said in August of 2016 when he said there were good people and bad people on both sides. And so when we start to look at when these individuals are building these monuments, they're saying in their mind, these individuals were heroes because they were fighting a just cause. They were fighting for states' rights. They were defending their very ideas. But whose voice was being lost in that movement? The individuals who were also fighting for their freedom. The millions of African Americans which one historian calls the Civil War the greatest slave revolution in American history, because these Black people on these slave plantations were not just waiting to be freed, as you see. After Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, Black people got up and fled to the North and joined these Union armies to come back to the South to fight to free their fellow brothers and sisters. And so getting back to your earlier question, in general, these monuments were erected to recreate or to provide a different interpretation of history of that particular movement, of the Civil War, if you will, and of the Confederate cause of the movement. These individuals were supposed to be gentlemen. This was just a misunderstanding amongst brothers. We don't need to castigate these individuals as being evil. It wasn't about slavery. I know you all have heard that argument throughout your life, that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. And that's why we should continue to honor the lost lives on both sides. While at the other end, you start to see it really pick up in the mid-20th century when Black people start to fight for human and civil rights. And what these individuals, these elected officials really now are wanting to remind these African Americans of where they live and where they will die, deep in the heart of Dixie. So now you see states start to recreate Southern flags. And if it's not overt, it's subvert, right? You still see the stars and bars embedded somewhere in these states' flags. You start to see monuments show up on public property that taxpayers are paying for. What taxpayer? All taxpayers. And so where is again the African American voice when these relics are being allowed to happen? So why were these flags and monuments allowed to happen? It was really created, these monuments and symbols and naming of streets and naming of schools, publicly funded, was really to not only change the way certain people looked at it, it changed the way, it was attempting to change the way we all looked at it. And one of the things that I tell my students when I teach the history of the Civil War, being someone who was born and raised in the Deep South my whole life, I moved to the Mid South for a period of time to go to pursue the PhD and came back to the Deep South. I can remember when I was a kid, to show you how the idea of the Confederacy and Dixie was inculcated in my heart. I can remember watching a television show in the early 80s with my father called The Dukes of Hazzard. Now, if you don't remember the Dukes of Hazzard, it was just about this community, and theoretically Hazzard County in Southwest Georgia. These individuals, the main character of the show was a car entitled the General Lee.
Lee, that's right.
The car, when you blew the horn, played the Confederate national anthem, Dixie. On the top of the car was the Confederate flag. And the main villain of the show was a gentleman by the name of J.D. Hall, Jefferson Davis Hall. Mm-hmm. And so throughout that series, as a young Black man, my mother purchased me a General Lee car, and that played the horn. And every episode, I cheered that the Duke boys would jump into General Lee and ride off into the sunset. From a historical perspective, we know that Americans love tragedy with a happy ending. And so when we look at shows like Dukes of Hazzard, when we look at even cartoons like the early Looney Tunes, where the rooster is whistling Dixie and all of that, all those things. If you live in the Deep South, you have Win Dixie and Dixie Crystal Sugar. When you see how deeply embedded the Confederacy and the idea of Dixie is in our lives, you also understand the complexity and the intentionality of those relics in our lives. And so coming to the 21st century and coming to today, it is so impressive, getting back to Chappelle's point, that it's taken the streets to say, A, that side lost the war. B, those individuals do not represent the ideals of America. Do they need those statues? We can argue about that. What I don't believe is arguable, that they should be on state grounds, they should be on state buildings, and they shouldn't be present. The reason that we don't need to forget those moments where possibly there should be a Civil War museum where you have Confederate statues, because what we should do, the same way that our Jewish brothers and sisters do at their bar mitzvahs, to remind our children, and not just Black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids, that we should never forget. Early historians of the late 19th century argued that the institution of slavery was the stain of world history. Somewhere in the reimagining of the Civil War, we act as though that part of our history no longer exists.
It's interesting when you said the stain of world history, right? You know, I won't even get into politics. That's a whole nother part. We could go on for, you know, hours and hours. But it is interesting that racism on full display in America, you know, launched a global movement, right? So you're talking about this situation on our grounds in the United States. Not obviously, you know, not even a first situation, not even a 17th situation in a certain time. And obviously, as we talked about with Christian Cooper, and I mean, just all these things, boom, 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 in a very small, compact time frame on top of a global pandemic, you know, created this, you know, this moment in time, this tipping point. But that is not just confined to these United States, right? I mean, you look overseas. I remember the first whatever report from the news, and you're looking, you know, in another country, and all of a sudden there's a movement. This is not, you know, Texas or, you know, California or, you know, Washington. This is like, you know, somewhere else, right? I'm like, wow. And then you see another country and another country. I'm like, and this is, you know, emanating from, you know, racism right here in the United States. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. Ace, you know, it's funny that Dr. Ellis spoke about the General Lee and or the Dukes of Hazzards in general, and them Duke boys, right? Bo and Luke Duke. Because that can easily be an analogy for a lot of discussions that are going on, right? In the sense of, you know, people are trying to hold on to their history, their heritage, right? That word, and working to tell another story than what it is. And man, there's some tough discussions already that I'm sure you all have had. Some very direct and clear. Ace, you and I might have talked about this, but I was talking to a colleague and reviewing something for them, as I was happy to do, as a communications specialist, reviewing something for somebody, and somebody used the word transparency, and I said, "Ooh, that's a complex word right there, because I don't know if people want transparency, right? I mean, transparency means we talk about everything and start uncovering things, right? Which means that we start talking about your daddy and your granddaddy and your granddaddy's daddy, right? I mean, there's a lot of discussion to be had. But again, a lot of people, oh, them Duke boys, those are some good boys, and right? I mean, they're good for the community, and they were fighting the bad guys and all that good stuff. However, there's a lot of other parts of that discussion that could easily go on. Ace, what do you say when you're having some of these discussions about these monuments and these statues, and you know, should they be dragged down the street and thrown into the river, or should they stand as they have been for historical purposes?
Yeah, the transparency term is really interesting, right? It's we say we want transparency. The reality is, white America has demanded from us complacency. They desire comfortability, perhaps, right? Why do I have to reimagine Bo and Luke as maybe on the wrong side when I've got this warm and fuzzy about the Dukes of Hazzard, about the mammy representation in Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, in the minstrel tune that came from Dixie. This idea that these things are comfortable to me, you know, the magical Black Negro trope that has proliferated cinema, you know. So when we think about those pieces, the idea that if we pull statues down, we erase history. If we, if we redesign or discontinue Aunt Jemima bottles, we erase history. The reality is I can still log on Wikipedia and see exactly what happened 100, 150, 200 years ago. You know, what history is disappearing, right? And so this idea that this is not heritage, it is hate, the quip I used to throw back in arguments or conversations or heated discussions, if you will, was, yeah, well, it was a heritage of hate. What's really interesting is I might reframe that and say it's a heritage of ignorance, right? Yes, there was hatred there, but if you think back to most of the charters of the secession charters of Confederate states, it was this idea that the black man, the black community is lesser than. The phrenology that went into that and the pseudo so-called science that informed that idea was that our brains can't work in the way that the white communities does, and we ought to be subjugated to slavery for our own good. And if that's the case, in the Virginia secession debates, we talked about slavery exponentially more than we ever did about states' rights. The only states' rights conversation was the right of states to own slaves. We talk about states' rights when it's convenient, and that very much has informed this lost cause ideology, the romanticism of the Gone with the Winds or the Dukes of Hazzard. And so if we actually talk about transparency, if we're being transparent about the conversation, let's be real. Sure, it was about states' rights because y'all wanted to own people and they didn't want you to. Sure, let's talk about, Aunt Jemima. Yeah, it makes you feel nice to have some warm black mammy around pouring syrup for you. Sure, let's be transparent about what that means. Let's be transparent about the heritage of the ignorance that informed the blood loss on both sides. Yes, people died, and yes, that is not ideal. But the idea, again, to Dr. Ellis's point, that historians have spoken about slavery as a stain on the world. I think even that is a convenient mistruth when we think about education throughout the South, right? I was taught about the War of Northern Aggression. That's this really subtle shifting of the narrative.
Yep.
The idea that slavery is a stain on the world says to us that the world did slavery and that America wasn't the last bastion of the most brutal version of that. To have that discussion transparently is really freaking uncomfortable. And that's what folks aren't ready to do. They're not ready to pull those things down because it says maybe we got it wrong years ago. Maybe we didn't do the right thing and we aren't glorifying the right people. That's not even to have the discussion of, I think we ought to put ideas on pedestals, not people. We can get there, but did we pick the right folks? And the answer is emphatically no. That's the hard conversation that folks don't want to have. That's how I feel about transparency. And that's often the discussion I have in the diversity, equity, and inclusion setting. Part history, part logic. And folks don't like the former if they don't like it.
Your logic, Ace.
Folks don't like history and they don't like logic if they don't agree with either. So, that's the big educational piece. What I'll end on is, the idea that from a historical perspective and an educational perspective, we are mistaught by design, right? Again, some of those pieces I mentioned and the subtle nuances to how we shift Civil War to War of Northern Aggression, right? They did something to us.
Yep.
It is not one's fault that we were taught that in grade school, right? We had Civil War Day in 5th grade, and I'm a little bit younger than the esteemed gentleman on the call. But I'd imagine something similar existed. We had Civil War Day and my mom challenged me. She's a carpetbagger, if you will. I say that with all love. She's from Philly. She said, all right, well, if it's Civil War Day, how would you have existed then? And, my black butt went to school as a slave on Civil War Day. And that was wildly uncomfortable for me and the other 4 black kids in 5th grade in my school. But it was right. And so this education, the folks who go to Jefferson Davis High School or, the rebels up at one of the high schools here, all of those subtle pieces are thrown into our existence. And it's really hard to break from that. Even as, we've got, 3 black guys here who loved and endeared in a lot of respects the Dukes of Hazzard. That is so indoctrinated in the way that we exist, and that is problematic. That's a systemic piece that we ought to be talking transparently about, if you will.
What about you, Dr. Ellis? As you, I'm sure, in scholarly, right? If you're talking to your colleagues in academia, What's that discussion like in the sense of what should be done with these statutes and monuments and relics? What's going on in your world?
Well, I think, we started this conversation in 2016 about, first of all, you got to have the conversation. You can't not have the conversation, right? You have to have, and it's an uncomfortable conversation because for so long, unfortunately, we haven't gotten the history right as it relates to why are these monuments up. So when you may have individuals that would say, well, that happened in the past, you just need to move on. Well, the past isn't with me every day, right? Here on what is it, on the City Hall's ground right here in Tallahassee, you have a Civil War monument. So
and the Capitol, the front yard of the old Capitol right here also in the state of Florida.
Okay, so you're not moving. It's not in the past for you. So we need to have this conversation first and foremost. And I also believe that when we start to think about the idea of, a transparent conversation about what do you replace them with? What do monuments are something that are very tricky. Like, so when you look at Florida A&M University, for example, we only have one monument on this campus, and that's of a football coach. And for some people, that was a very controversial idea, right, in and of itself. And if you look at universities, what does it take to have a building named after you? So when we start to think about honoring someone with a monument, or honoring someone with a building or a school named after them, honoring someone who with a street named after them, it takes a transparent conversation from all parties. Eventually, I'm not sure if we're there yet, because again, I'll go back to what I've been saying earlier. The streets are speaking, and we should allow them to speak. Everyone has to have a seat at the table. But once they have spoken, now it's time for another set of conversations. Once we remove these monuments, are we going to A, replace them? B, if they're removed, what are we going to do with them? C, if we replace them with someone else, are there standards that need to be replaced them with? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I'll just say, from a historical perspective, we don't need to repeat the history that happened in the late 19th and early 20th century, where everybody didn't have a voice in that conversation. Because if that does happen 150 to 100 years from now, we will be back in the same place. Let's keep in mind, well, I'll stop there, and we can.
No, let's keep in mind, please.
Well, what I was going to say, let's keep in mind, when we start to think about, the modern civil rights movement, Vincent Harding wrote this great book entitled There's a River. And Black people, since the enslavement of Black people and the survival of the Middle Passage and the survival of the institution of slavery, had always been fighting for one thing: not civil rights, but human rights. These individuals, especially when you start to think about the idea of history, the nation just celebrated Independence Day last weekend. And if you go back and really study the nuances of the development of this nation is really nothing more than an idea. There are no real borders. You can go from John, you can go to Georgia in less than 30 minutes. Nobody's asking for passports, right? So it's just an idea. But when you start to look at James Baldwin's concept, if the idea of America is true, how great it would be for everybody, right? Because the idea is a beautiful thing. The idea of democracy, the idea of freedom, but it's something unique about what the Confederacy did with that idea. They said that this idea is only for a small group of people. And so I think that when we have these transparent conversations, that's why it's really important that you don't get rid of historians, that you actually add more historians. Mm-hmm. I had this conversation a few weeks ago.
Or scientists.
Yeah. Yeah, true. I said, imagine if now in the midst of COVID, we didn't have public health administrators or public health officials, right? And so we are in a pandemic of racism that we've been in since, 1619, right? And so we need more individuals who have a nuanced way of looking at the past and making it relevant for the present. So I think that those are the type of transparent conversations that we need to have.
We're gonna wrap up, but I want to get your feedback in the sense of arming other brothers. Obviously, this is a great discussion that a lot of people can learn from, but specifically, this is for men of color and more specifically Black men, right? So in arming brothers with, information, even to just have some succinct speaking points to respond with. I want to hear from both of you. And Dr. Ellis, you just referenced something. We'll start with Ace and go to you, but you just referenced something, because life is about perspective, right? You referenced on FAMU's campus, Florida A&M University, we have one monument, right, or one statue of somebody, which that could easily change if certain people have their way. And I'll leave that discussion alone for the time being, Dr. Ellis, and I support that discussion. But that discussion in the sense of that monument, being a football coach, immediately my blood pressure started to rise, right? Because I'm like, hey, wait a minute, don't be talking about Coach Gaither, right? I mean, there should be monuments of Coach Gaither on other college campuses, as a matter of fact. But that's my perspective. That's my perspective. I could easily have a discussion with folks in academia that could be like, that is ridiculous. And that's any university, right? Like somebody at UCLA, trust me, we could put folks from the athletic department and folks from, academic sphere in that room and battle all day, and athletics can say our budgets and revenue that come in help fund your research and on and on and on. That's an ongoing discussion, right? But that's my perspective. I have a love for Coach Gaither. I understand the value of Coach Gaither. If somebody sat me down and started telling me the specifics of why that might not have made sense, or why it should have been somebody related to a university president or an administrator or somebody that helped make sure that the FAMU hospital was in place or something of that nature. If somebody sat down and broke down a history logically, right? I'm an engineer, so maybe my mind helps me to understand that logically. I could receive that information and maybe take a different approach to things, right? But it's hard when you're so close to it. So Ace, I'll start with you, right? Because that person on that horse up there, that person standing with that slave in front, kneeled down in a couched position, I think is Frederick Douglass would say, or that term that he would use. That's somebody's granddaddy, right? That's somebody's great granddaddy. That people are close to it, right? So when whether it's by formal vote and done in that fashion, or whether it's by, as Dr. Ellis said, the street taking action, if that statue, that monument is coming down, somebody on the other side of this discussion, for one of your brothers, one of your good friends, Dr. Ellis, could easily be approached with a response because somebody's so close to it. What would be the response to that person to just make them understand a point of view, hopefully logically, a point of view that makes sense? That makes sense in the sense of we're moving forward in progress, and this is why it doesn't make sense to have that monument, that statue here today in 2020. What would you say, Ace?
Yeah, I think four major pieces come to mind for me. The idea of symbolism mattering, right? And I kind of mentioned the contrast of Confederate statue versus Black Lives Matter murals, and I hesitate to and refuse to perhaps equate the two. They are not the same, but in the debate, if we're having a philosophical debate about symbols, clearly they do matter. I'd say the extension of that argument is, there is imagery of United States servicemen pulling down statues elsewhere. We pulled down Saddam immediately. We got U.S. Marines up on a ladder pulling down Saddam Hussein, but we can't pull down arguably, reasonably, factually treasonous individuals who fought against the United States, right? So that would
That's
be
right.
the first one. Symbols matter, and if they didn't, we wouldn't pull down those of folks that we disagree with around the world. And it's the same American flag toting guys who are having the conversation about symbols not mattering, but support our troops. So there's some missed opportunities there, I think, for debate. The second piece is history, and Dr. Ellis spoke to it. History is important, and historians help inform that narrative. The historical inaccuracies, right? This idea of wildly masterful tacticians and folks that we ought to glorify. You know, Stonewall got shot by his own side and died of pneumonia, right? Like, it was not this glorious, you know, out in a ball of fire. You know, his own team took him down. And that's not to eviscerate a general. It is to be very intentional about who we are lauding and putting on a pedestal. Similarly, the flag follows that narrative. The flag that we see typically representing the Confederacy was the flag of the Northern Army here in Virginia, the battle flag of the Northern Army of Virginia. You know, the actual Confederate flag that flew during the Civil War is not what we typically see. And so, you know, it's just wild misinformation. And does that point ring true when you're talking to somebody with a Confederate flag bumper sticker on their car and you say, well, that's not accurate? It's not going to move the needle, but it makes the point that you are missing something. And if you do your homework, if you dig a little bit, you might better understand what you're talking about. And the last piece, we've spoken to it already, was the states' rights piece, because that's always where we land is, well, it wasn't even about slavery. Oh, it was. And I won't wax poetic on that one, but those would be my four pieces, right? Like, what are we celebrating, and do we know that symbols matter? Clearly, our country believes that. Secondly, are we accurate in what we're talking about? Why did those statues go up? When did they go up, right? They say it was after the Civil War. Dr. Ellis spoke to the fact that in Richmond, 1910 to 1920 was the decade in which most of our statues went up. That was post-Reconstruction as we started inching towards Jim Crow, and they were meant to be opposing, and they were funded by white supremacist groups. It was the sons and daughters of the Confederacy. If we contextualize that and put it in 2020 and said, when did they go up? Who put them up? Who paid for them? If we thought about those things today in that same context, those statues would have never gone up. And the last piece is statues, people, history is relative and contextualized in that they might have made sense then. Do we believe that now? Those would be my 4 or 5 points that I'd share with folks.
Dr. Ellis, what about you? What's your response?
I wouldn't necessarily have 4 or 5 points. I would just go back, because one of the things that I truly believe at the core of most individuals in the United States of America, at their core, is that they believe and they love the idea of America. And so I'll come back to that point. They believe and they love the idea of America. And so I'll just read this quick passage and let's see how that resonates with individuals, and juxtapose that with the concept of the Confederacy. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And so, if we are going to memorialize anything in the United States of America, we must memorialize what the concept and the idea of what this nation was built on: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all, not for a few.
For all. Amen. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time and attention and expertise. Dr. Ellis, I will end on the fact when you referenced how much historians are needed. I fully agree. There's a discussion, obviously a lot of attention on Frederick Douglass this close to 4th of July, and his piece, his great historic piece about the 4th of July. There's a recent debate or discussion going on between two academics, and really understanding kind of globally, understanding a lot about Frederick Douglass, and brought in even a third scholar, and they found some or unearthed a letter from Frederick Douglass. So we need your historians to keep poking and finding information and informing us. And then lastly, I'll say, just as a reminder, we need justice for Breonna Taylor. All right. So thank you, gentlemen. God bless you. Look to have you back on at some point. Dr. Ellis, always welcome you, Ace, and we'll talk soon, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Respect.
This was great.